Coming up on this week's episode of Insight Weekly, we're discussing the impact COVID-19 has had on the activity of non-state violent actors across the globe. This includes the ELN in Colombia, the Italian mafia in Italy, as well as the increase in attacks from ISIS across the Middle East and other armed groups in Africa. Stay tuned to find out more. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Insight Weekly. If you enjoy our content, please like, share and comment. Feel free to ask us any questions and you may just feature on next week's podcast. Last week, following our episode where we discussed the global food security situation across the world as a result of COVID-19, we got a question on LinkedIn. Our senior regional analyst for the Americas, Vincent Fevrier, is going to answer that. So the question was how the global food security situation would actually look, in particular in North America, in the US. So Vincent, would you like to take us through that, please?
So in regards to food security within the United States, there's been several issues. Initial panic buying caused disruptions to the supply chain in regards to supermarkets, but we saw that issue across most of the world. Other issues that have impacted this food supply chain within the United States has been the temporary restrictions on H-2A visas granted to temporary farm workers in the United States. Another issue that we saw with the food supply chain has been the slow response by the U.S. Department of Agriculture in regards to buying up surplus stock from farms. Over the weekend, the chairman of Tyson Foods, one of the United States' biggest meat processors, warned that the food supply chain was breaking and that millions of pounds of meat would disappear from the food supply chain. This week, on Tuesday, we saw President Trump make an announcement declaring meat processing facilities as critical infrastructure in order to try and stem the closures and keep the facilities open in order to prevent shortages in pork, beef, and other meat products. However, what we may see are price increases at supermarkets, as well as potentially the reduction in the availability of certain meat products. We're not likely to see mass emptying of shelves, but a reduction in what people have in terms of choice is something that we can see.
Thank you very much, Vincent. So in this week, we're actually discussing non-state violent actors and the impact COVID-19 has had on their activity across each region. So non-state violent actors are things such as organised crime groups, terrorist groups and other armed groups. So this week we're discussing the ELN in Colombia, the activity of the Italian mafia in response to COVID-19, as well as a rise that we've seen in Iraq with regards to attacks from Islamic State, and the potential for attacks across Africa as COVID-19 starts to evolve across that continent. First of all, we'll head back to Vincent, who will take us through the Americas.
Yeah, so this week in Colombia, starting on the 1st of May, so tomorrow, the ceasefire that the ELN had declared at the beginning of the month to allow the government to respond to COVID-19 will end. There's so far no indication that the ELN will extend the ceasefire, so it could lead to several scenarios. They could either continue to uphold the ceasefire and not attack government targets, or they could turn around and take advantage of COVID-19 spreading throughout the military. So there's been several cases reported at several military bases. And so they could take advantage of this and perpetrate several attacks. If they do so, some targets would be the government, the police, but other sectors that have been targeted before by the group, such as the oil and gas sector, could also potentially be targeted. Ultimately, COVID-19 hasn't had a massive impact on armed groups in Colombia. So while the ELN has had a ceasefire and some groups that monitor it said that they didn't commit attacks during this period, there's also been some attacks within territory that they control that has yet to be attributed to a group. So it's possible that the ELN did commit those attacks. During this period, however, the ELN and FARC dissidents have fought each other in several areas of the country, as well as the ELN versus the Clan del Golfo, and FARC dissidents within each other. So armed activity has continued throughout the country, and we've also seen an attack on police forces by FARC dissidents after police forces were ambushed by being told that some people had COVID-19 in the community and were deployed to the area. Ultimately, armed groups have also, like in other areas of Central America or South America, in Colombia, they've enforced quarantine measures. So we've seen FARC dissidents threaten some communities to uphold quarantine measures, and we've also seen the ELN do so.
So, Vincent, besides armed groups enforcing quarantine measures in Colombia, have organized crime groups in Central America taken similar steps? How has COVID-19 affected their activities, you'd say?
Yeah, Aaron. So in regards to organized crime in Central America, we've seen a few things regarding their role and COVID-19. So one of the things that we've seen is a disruption in their supply chains, whether it comes from precursor chemicals or counterfeit goods. Most of these goods come from China, and so when China initially put their lockdown on the outbreak of COVID-19, some of these goods couldn't come to Mexico, and therefore prices of certain drugs have increased due to precursor chemicals not being able to come into Mexico. There's also been reports that some merchants that get extorted in Mexico City have kind of pushed back against the cartels just because the cartel hasn't been able to supply them with counterfeit goods to sell in their stores. So that is something that I will keep an eye out in the coming weeks, just to kind of see if these merchants, if there's a real pushback, and if violence potentially increases due to them refusing to pay extortion fees. Ultimately, what we've seen is that the violence hasn't decreased in Mexico. March saw one of the most violent months in the last 2 years in Mexico. And we've continued to see this violence throughout April. We've seen several mass murders in Guanajuato, the state where several cartels are fighting each other for control of the drug trade as well as oil theft. We've also seen violence just recently in the state of Michoacan, where the CJNG is said to have killed at least 18 rivals who were in an encampment in rural part of the state. However, these cartels and these criminal groups in Central America have used COVID-19 as a means to consolidate their power over their territory, as well as gain popular support. One of the ways that they've done so is through the distribution of food parcels. So we've seen several cartels in Mexico, such as the Gulf Cartel, an arm of the Sinaloa Cartel, the CJNG Cartel, distribute food parcels to rural areas where state governments and federal government hasn't been able to reach or don't have the means to reach there. We've also seen El Chapo's daughter distribute food parcels as well, with the logo of El Chapo on the side of boxes. So when they distribute those food, a lot of them have their own logos and their own messaging to go with it, just to make sure that the people know where this food's coming from. We've all in Central America, such as in Guatemala or El Salvador, we've seen groups like Barrio 18 or MS-13 tell merchants they wouldn't have to pay extortion fees during this period, during the quarantine period. However, it's likely that we'll see a rise in violence around certain areas after the quarantine measures are removed, as these gangs will likely want to collect and collect back pay as well, and merchants won't be able to pay their extortion fees. And so these gangs will likely probably lead to an increase in violence towards merchants after the quarantine measures.
What I find interesting there is the hearts and minds strategy used by the cartels. It sounds very similar to what's been happening in Italy, where the Italian mafia has also been distributing food and essential goods. The mafia organization, the 'Ndrangheta, they have also been known to provide struggling businesses with cheap loans. With this type of aid, they can buy influence, they can buy goodwill, and it allows them at a later stage to extort the businesses that they bought shares in. In fact, just yesterday we saw business owners in Milan take to the street to protest the lockdown measures. And these measures are effectively choking their businesses. And if they want financial support, the Italian mafia is one who provides it. So this virus is really providing a window of opportunity for this group in particular to expand their power. But talking about organized crime groups in a more general sense in Europe, most of them rely on drug trafficking as their major source of income. And this doesn't seem to be affected as much by the virus. So in our open source reporting, we've seen a lot of drug seizures, but this is also reflected by statements coming from major ports of entry, such as Rotterdam and Zaventem Airport in Brussels, where they are recording record high drug seizures during this period. Maybe drug traffickers are expecting less controls, but the supply side hasn't changed that much because drug dealing has just moved from one place to the next, with drug couriers now posing as food delivery drivers to not stand out during the lockdown. Besides, the demand is still there because people are stockpiling drugs just as they are toilet paper. So this period really provides, really strengthens organized crime in Europe in many ways.
So, Aaron, you talked about organized crime, but have you seen any change in terrorist activity?
Yeah, so Max, you can fill in here if you want. But both Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State have urged their followers not to travel during the crisis. At first, they celebrated as a punishment to China and the Western world. China is occasionally being mentioned by ISIS because of the treatment of Uyghur Muslims. But their attitude towards the virus started to change as soon as it took hold in the Middle East. And now they urge their followers to stay inside and to pray and to reflect. But if you weren't already potential terrorist in Europe and you wanted to travel to Europe, you'd likely end up in Spain or Italy, or if you pose as a refugee at a Greek refugee camp. And those are places that you don't necessarily want to be during this crisis. So I think that's why we have not seen as much terrorist activity in Europe. Going forward, with the lockdowns being lifted and travel picking back up again, that threat will just come back. The targets will likely be different, though, because mass gatherings will be the last thing to return to our normal lives. So I think that's something to look out for. What about you, Viraj? Have you seen any changes in terrorist activity during COVID-19 in Africa?
Yeah, so I think it's too soon to say what kind of tactical impact COVID-19 is having on terrorism. That said, as long as curfews, bans on gatherings, just like you mentioned, and inter-urban transport bans remain in place, the likelihood of terrorist attacks on soft targets, I think, will remain low in urban environments. But at the same time, these coronavirus measures are likely not being enforced well in rural areas. So I expect the terrorist threat and trends to remain in areas of high terrorist activity. While lockdowns, and curfews may be short-term measures, I think bans and large gatherings will remain in place for much of the year, especially in urban areas, and depending on how well these measures are enforced, I think it could deter terrorist attacks on civilians. The impact, of the outbreak on tourism will likely mean that the likelihood of terrorist attacks on hotels, for example, is low. Another area where the coronavirus outbreak could affect terrorist activity is their revenue stream. So if a large amount of the population, in Al-Shabaab controlled areas were to get infected, for example, this could sort of affect their tax base and extortion rackets. I think this could drive terrorist groups to widen extortion rackets, target banks like ISIS have done in the past, and, and I think also potentially loot NGOs as well. If we do see a huge sort of economic impact that many are predicting that coronavirus will have, or more specifically, coronavirus response measures will have, I think terrorist groups will likely tap into the discontent, and alienation, and essentially the breakdown, in the relationship between governments and the populace, to drive recruitment and widen the ranks.
So, has the coronavirus outbreak had any impact on the military or the police force's capacity to carry out peacekeeping operations in their respective countries?
Yeah, so on the counterterrorism and peacekeeping front, I think coronavirus cases have been confirmed within the Nigerian army, in Borno State, the MINUSMA mission in Mali, France's Operation Barkhane mission in the Sahel region, and even this week, the AMISOM mission in Somalia. So, the virus has affected a rotation of staff. But if we do see cases rise within these missions and impact operations, especially those on the front line, of securing vulnerable populations, and if this was to reduce the efficacy, of these missions and leave vulnerable populations more at risk of attacks, I think last year, there were protests where protesters demanded MINUSMA, in Mali, and Operation Barkhane. They leave Mali. Al-Qaeda really did tap into this sentiment and have used it as part of their propaganda. So other than that, I think coronavirus could impact sort of troop morale, and this will again impact the efficacy of military missions and contribute to the lack of sort of sharpness and leave sort of bases, forward operating bases more exposed potentially. How about you, Max? Have you seen any change?
The changes have been quite hard to identify at times because there's always so much going on across the Middle East and in Asia itself. So, but regardless, there have been quite a series of noticeable changes. I think the first I want to talk about is there's been 3 noticeable ceasefires in Asia that have been called almost directly as a result of COVID-19. So there's one in Yemen, in Afghanistan, and as well, almost Afghanistan, and in the Philippines. So in Afghanistan, there's already peace talks going on between the US government, the Afghan government, and the Afghan Taliban. But quite recently, the Afghan Taliban agreed to carry out full ceasefires in Taliban-controlled areas if there was a major outbreak of the disease. So it's quite a vague agreement, and it's very much just a vocal agreement. It's not sure what's been put down in official text or in documents about this yet. But the comments being made by the Taliban and whether or not they'll actually enforce it and what they define as a major outbreak hasn't been clarified yet. So this is a very minor step, I guess. It's not really a concrete step on the way to a major ceasefire, but it's worth mentioning. In Yemen, there's also been a ceasefire that was agreed to by both sides, and the whole point of it was because of the COVID-19 outbreak, and it was to try and allow aid and other NGOs to operate in Yemen a bit more easily, rather than having to contend with fighting across the country. However, the very next day after this was agreed, both sides were back to exchanging fire. There were airstrikes, there was artillery fire, and even ballistic missile attacks across the country. So on our incident map right now, you can see a cluster of markers around provinces such as Al Jawf in the north, Baida in central Yemen, and as well as around Hodeidah, where there's a lot of NGO activity. And all this is made even more complicated by the fact that the Southern Transitional Council, which is a separatist group based in southern Yemen, recently announced self-rule. So essentially, they've split from the Yemeni government, and this just further complicates the matter. This makes it not only more difficult for NGOs and other groups such as the WHO to operate in Yemen because there's so many different conflicting orders within the country itself, but also provides an opening for militant groups, whether that be ACAP, ISIS, or even the Houthis in Yemen itself, just because now the forces opposing them are so much more fractured than they ever were before. So with that in mind, Yemen, yes, it has been a ceasefire, but there's plenty more going on, and the ceasefire has been largely ignored. So the impact of it is going to be very minimal. And finally, I thought it'd be worth looking at in East Asia, in the Philippines, where the New People's Army, which is a communist rebel group based in the Philippines, they've declared a ceasefire due to COVID-19, essentially as part of I guess you could call it political point scoring from both sides as well, who have agreed to the ceasefire just to allow NGO teams to access areas of the Philippines which are incredibly remote and typically have been strongholds of the MPA. So there's been 3 ceasefires that are worth paying attention to. However, how strong they'll be and how much of an impact they'll actually have in their respective countries, we're yet to see for now.
And Max, talking about these ceasefires, do you think there's any chance of any successes from them despite their initial failures?
I think obviously it has to be looked at country by country basis. So in the Philippines, it's probably the most successful of the three because there has been a significant reduction in clashes between the MPA rebels and Philippine military. In Afghanistan, this is quite a complicated issue at the moment because there's so many different factors adding into the ongoing peace talks, and COVID-19 is quite a minor one, really, because the Taliban declaration that they'll have a ceasefire in COVID-affected areas is only part of the broader peace talk narrative. So both sides have been engaging in peace talks for quite a while, and fighting's really resumed there. So currently, in the short term, it doesn't look like there's any hope of immediate success for the peace talks because fighting's just picking up every single day. However, in the long term, the fact that both sides have approached peace talks and are engaging in peace talks, I think suggests some progress potentially in the long term. But to summarize, in the short term, certainly not. And in Yemen, I think the COVID-19 agreement, ceasefire agreement, I think is probably the least likely to have any short or long-term success. Simply because I get the impression from what's been happening on Yemen in the ground with multiple incidents of fighting and airstrikes and other violent incidents, I get the impression that this ceasefire was agreed more just for political point scoring. There doesn't seem to have been any intention to have stuck to the ceasefire. And you can really see this in the way that the comparison between fighting before the ceasefire was agreed and after has changed very little, if at all. So in the Philippines, yes, there could be hopes for a longer ceasefire, whereas in Afghanistan, you have to look in the long term. Immediate success from these talks simply aren't forthcoming. And in Yemen, I think there's much less chance of success from these peace talks. I also just wanted to talk about Iraq, where there's been talk about Islamic State who have increased the rate of their attacks during this COVID-19 period. And whether or not this is because of COVID-19, I think is worth exploring. So as Aaron's already said, the Islamic State is taking quite a pragmatic approach to the COVID-19 outbreak on their propaganda level. But how they actually work at a tactical level in the various countries where they have fighters often varies somewhat. So in Iraq, yes, there has been a big increase in attacks, and this is certainly worth noticing. And these have mostly taken place in Diyala province and Kirkuk province, where there's been mostly attacks on checkpoints, but there's also been incidents such as firing mortars into villages, perhaps villages that haven't paid taxes to Islamic State or have opposed Islamic State at some point in the recent past. So the reason for this increase in attacks during the COVID-19 period is only partly due to COVID-19. I think it's worth stressing. So yes, the Islamic State are trying to take advantage of the situation, but this is mostly because Iraqi security forces have lost their backing, a lot of the backing of their US allies. US forces are currently pulling out of Iraq, and this has led to deficiencies in things such as intelligence and airstrikes in support of troops in contact. So the offensive capability of Iraqi forces has reduced, and as a result, they're less able to target Islamic State activity. And therefore, Islamic State fighters have been able to move around a bit more freely than they used to have been before the US troop withdrawal began. Also, COVID-19 has forced Iraqi security forces to commit more personnel to enforcing the lockdowns. So yes, COVID-19 has had an impact here because troops are not being used to fight Islamic State as much as they would have. Instead, they're being used to enforce curfews in Iraq's major cities. So yes, there has been an increase in IS activity in Iraq during the COVID-19 period, but this is only partly due to COVID-19. So it would be wrong to say it's directly that it's only as a result of COVID-19. You've got to take into account there's plenty of other factors.
Thank you, Max. And thank you, team, for another insightful episode of Insight Weekly this week. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel to make sure you receive new episodes direct to your inbox every single Friday. I'll also be adding some useful links to our free COVID-19 resources into the YouTube description. This includes a link to a 48-hour free trial, unlimited access to over 400,000 security incidents across the globe, instant access and no credit card required. So if you want to make better security decisions during this unprecedented time, sign up today. Until next week, stay safe.